Hello again, this is Grant Swartzwelder, and welcome to another episode of Oilfield Strong. If you like the episode that's about to come, or if you like the series, please let other people know and follow our Oilfield Strong podcast, either on where you see your podcast or on YouTube. But really appreciate your attendance at this and your interest in these subjects. We have a fascinating topic that's going to be discussed with a wonderful speaker, and let's get into that right now. You know, for over the years, America has drilled millions of wells. Those wells come off on really strong, and then they decline like all wells do. Eventually, those wells, as they decline, they become marginal in its ability to produce oil and the economics associated with it. It's such an important topic because those marginal wells still are the backbone of the oil industry and so many economies across America. But that's where they become a growing debate. As these wells get more and more marginal, something has to be done. They end up stop producing. They end up needing to be plugged. But who does that? Who's responsible for it? If no one takes that on, then they become an orphan well. Most folks believe that there's at least 140,000 orphan wells out in America right now, and many believe there's a lot more than that exists that just haven't been documented or identified. So then that's where it gets really complicated. Who takes care of that? What are the environmental aspects of that? But this all becomes more than just simply an economy versus environmental type question. It really becomes a larger question of what to do with the last chapter of the oil field or the oil production cycle. Well, to address that, we're very fortunate to have as our speaker Adam Peltz, who is the director and senior attorney for EDF's energy program. From that, he focuses on oil, gas, carbon sequestering, regulation policy, a whole host of things directly related to our topic at hand. He's a great advocate for this, has obviously a perspective that I think is very important for us to understand, that of from Environmental Defense Fund and on the environmental side. But I maintain that the oil industry really cares about these issues and will respect what he has to say. So with that, I welcome Adam to the program, and I appreciate you attending and being my guest. So with that, let's start off with, thank you, Adam. So let's start off. Tell me a little bit more about what the problem is, how big it is, and how it manifests itself.
Sure. So you were right, Grant. Across the United States, there's something like 141,000 documented orphan wells. And on top of that, there are, and state estimate, maybe 800,000 or more undocumented orphan wells. On top of that, there are hundreds of thousands of inactive wells. And then on top of that, the majority of active producing oil and gas wells in the United States are marginal, which is to say producing less than 15 BOE a day, something like 625,000. And so all of these wells represent a liability to the public, whether through decommissioning costs, through methane emissions, through groundwater contamination, air toxics, property value diminution, limits on what you could do with the subsurface, et cetera. And so there's this huge population of wells of many stripes in at least 30 states that have all these externalities that need to be internalized somehow. And I think this issue was not really on the national political radar until recently. And now more and more policymakers at the federal level and at the state level are grappling with the huge legacy infrastructure management and retirement process. And that's what we're here to talk about today.
No, I'd agree with that. I think most of our listeners will know the answer to this, but I think it's good to have as a baseline. Give me an idea of what a marginal well is and what an orphan well is, and how they, from a definition standpoint, and what the kind of the pros and cons of each are.
Sure. So marginal wells are usually considered wells that produce less than 15 barrel of oil equivalent a day. And so that's either a barrel of oil or something like 6 MCF is the equivalent. There are other definitions. Sometimes people talk about stripper wells, which can be 15 or 10. And then submarginal wells, which some people talk about at below 1 barrel of oil of production a day. And then there are inactive wells, which have a owner on record and who is responsible for managing those wells, but they're not producing. And every state has a little bit different of a definition of that. Usually a well is considered inactive if it hasn't produced for 12 months or more. And an orphan well is a well that is not producing and is unplugged, but it has no responsible party available to cover decommissioning costs. And that population is 141,000 documented, which is to say a state or a tribe or a federal land management agency has gone through a process to say, we know that this well is out there. We cannot find anybody who's responsible for it to pay for its closure and decommissioning. And so we, the state or tribe or federal land management agency, have to take it on.
Very good. On the marginal side definition, it always interests me because that's a strict definition of 15 barrels. But if you really look at economics, there's wells that are economic at 2 barrels, and there's wells that are uneconomic at 15 barrels. All depends on lifting costs, taxes, a whole variety of things. So does that affect? Go ahead.
It very much so. And if it's oil versus gas, that also affects things a lot. 15 BOE in gas has a much different value than 15 BOE in oil.
And then when you start talking emissions, I've seen up to 50% of the emissions that come from the oil producing or oil wells or producing wells come from marginal. So there's a target that if you really want to worry about emissions, you attack the marginal wells. But then the problem with that is there's so many of them that it's a little emissions for a whole lot of wells that add up. So it creates issues on how to manage that.
Exactly. And so what we found in our science work is as you say, something like 15% of upstream emissions in the US seem to come from marginal wells. And we also found that 70% of emissions are from dispersed sources emitting less than 100 kilograms an hour, which is consistent with the 50% of emissions coming from marginal well findings. And so, if you think about the marginal well population, it's 80% of the wells, it's 5% of production, and 50% of emissions. And so what do you do about it? For one thing, just saying that 50% of emissions come from marginal wells does not tell you what you need to know to solve the problem, because there's a huge difference between the 10 to 15, the 5 to 10s, the 1 to 5s, the 0 to 1s. There's
Clearly
huge differences across basins and well ages and well types and all sorts of factors. And that has not yet been studied. And so we don't really know the distribution of methane emissions from marginal wells. We know that, or we think we know that it's around 50%, but how the distribution works is still work yet to happen.
So let's talk the economics and kind of what the negative consequences of these marginal wells could be. You've got environmental, which obviously you're well addressed at, but there's also the economic side of it. And there's other things like property value, kind of lifestyle, things like that.
So we know that the presence of orphan wells, at least, tends to reduce property values significantly. So one study from the University of Pittsburgh found that the presence of orphan wells reduces building activity, which is a proxy for property values and property tax collection, by 50%. So that's pretty significant. And the presence of old wellbores, or really any wellbore, stymies other subsurface geologic uses. And so if you want to frack a new well, you have to make sure that your frack is not going to intersect other wellbores and cause frac hits or blowouts or sanding in the wells or that sort of thing. If you want to do a carbon sequestration project or any kind of underground injection control project, you need to do an area of review and look for fluid conduits and make sure that they will not be a source of fluid migration. There's a water impact issue too. The primary reason why we plug wells, or at least the reason why states started well plugging requirements, including Texas in the 1920s, so 100 years of well plugging requirements in Texas, was A, to protect the resource from being watered out, and then B, to protect groundwater. So groundwater protection is really at the core of state oil and gas regulatory mission, and is also at the core of the underground injection control program. And there's an air toxics issue as well. In addition to methane, you get VOCs and all sorts of things coming out of the wells, unless they're controlled. You can get ozone non-attainment problems. You can get release of carcinogenic chemicals like benzene. Of course, there's hydrogen sulfide, which is probably the worst of the bunch. And so there are all these things that can be managed, but if they're not managed, can cause economic and social problems.
In the methane and those emission releases, you can kind of see or smell. It's the thing that happens underneath the ground that always worries me, because you don't really know what's going on from leakage and contamination of fresh water. How do you think, like, for example, Texas, they have a sit style or sit procedure for plugging a well. How do you think that handles the potential risk for that?
Well, one thing worth saying is that you can't actually see methane, and you can't necessarily smell it unless you have VOCs in with it too. And that's why it was an invisible problem for a long time. Now that we have FLIR cameras and things along those lines, you actually can see the methane emissions and satellites, and now we're seeing them, and we're trying to reduce them. But maybe you can run your question about plugging by me again to make sure I understand.
Well, just worried about downhole with a lot of these orphan wells. When you do plug them, are the procedures adequate to make sure that we don't have contamination of fresh water, that they stay plugged? Because we have seen recently a conversation or examples where these wells kind of come back to life. The pressure because of water
problem.
Injection from offset, from frac, something creates these things to flow back up to the surface, and then it becomes even more expensive.
Sure. So state plugging regulations vary in quality. None of them are perfect. They, most of them have been adjusted iteratively over time. But plugging's been a kind of, I don't want to say backwater part of the industry, but not really the focus of innovation and investment, because unlike every other aspect of oil and gas development, plugging doesn't make you money. It's just a cost,
right.
And it doesn't determine whether you're able to take the oil and gas out of the ground. And so, people cut corners. So there's the rules, and you can look at the rules and see, okay, do they require adequate cement quality and mixed water quality and proper testing and tagging and all of that kind of stuff? And is the regulator making sure that you're plugging, you have adequate cement covering the production zone, flow zones, corrosive zones, and protected water zones? So there's kind of the rules question. And then there's the question of, are people following the rules, and are the regulators able to track that?
And what do you think about that? Do you think they are?
Yeah, so Texas has a policy where every orphan well plug job is supposed to have an inspector on site pretty much the whole time. That's what they say they do. Whether or not that actually happens in the field, Grant, you may know better than I. There's a goal to witness plugging jobs generally, but that doesn't always happen. Other states that don't have as many inspectors aren't able to necessarily meet that goal. And then there's also the question of, if you have a well that was plugged in, let's say, the 1970s, was it plugged according to the rules at the time? Were those rules good enough? And what's happened in the last 50 years? Do those plug jobs still have integrity?
It's amazing how
then there's the
nature
que-
has a way of eroding the quality of the steel, of the cement, and they kind of start having issues later on.
all engineered solutions fail eventually. And, I don't know exactly when the first well was plugged, but let's say it was 1900 with mud or something like that. So we don't have a forever amount of time where we've been able to watch these plug jobs. So even the best we could do is say what happens over 125 years. Well, what about 125,000 years? Geology is old.
Yep.
But there's another issue, which is that, thinking about the zombie wells, there were a lot of wells that were plugged in West Texas that were probably plugged properly at the time that did not isolate intervals that are currently being pressured up with shallow wastewater injection. So even if everything had gone properly at the time, it's very hard to future-proof against anything that might happen. And so, that's why we're having, that's one of the reasons why there are so many plug failures and blowouts in West Texas.
Well, I think the other aspect of that, not to take a hard ride into talking about plugging all the time here, but it's not doing a bond log. You don't really know what's behind that pipe, the quality of the cement behind that. So then when you're making certain assumptions to put your cement in, you might be having issues uphole that you're just not aware of.
Yes, and that gets back to your original prompt, which is that there's only so much you can know about what's going on downhole. We can't see it. You can run instrumented surveys, which are good, but they're expensive and they're not all created equal, and then you have to interpret them properly. And so there's a lot of guesswork.
So when you have all these marginal wells and you're talking so many of them, and not even marginal, the orphan wells, well, both. The economics associated with that, there's a push and pull because the numbers would say that if you really get after plugging, that could create a whole industry or expand that industry. But at the other side is there are so many communities within the state of Texas and other oil producing states that the ecosystem thrives on or lives around these marginal wells. So depending on what you have to do or you do to those wells, you could have a huge effect one way or the other. So how do you manage that within y'all's policy and your what y'all are promoting?
Well, carefully. But let's start with the orphan wells are the easy case. They have to be plugged. The state has an intention to plug them. Right now, the population of those in Texas is 11,000. And this is a spike. The orphan well population in Texas had been pretty steady between, let's say, 7,000 and 9,000 for some time, because Texas has been investing $20 million a year plus in plugging orphan wells since the early 1980s, when the problem was getting out of hand. And there was a consensus decision to direct some of the severance tax revenues from industry into a state plugging fund. And so the Railroad Commission has been plugging wells for a long time and keeping the orphan well population from getting out of hand. But that dynamic has changed a little bit, and now we're seeing a spike in orphan wells. And so that's a problem. And everyone agrees that you want to get your orphan wells plugged as quickly as you can. Then there's inactive wells. And so Texas has 115,000 inactive production wells and around 150,000 total inactive wells. The balance are UIC wells and things along those lines. The over 59, something like 59% of those inactive wells have been inactive for 5 years or more. And once a well in Texas has been inactive for more than 5 years, the chance of it ever returning to service is around 15%. And for the 15% that do return to service after 5 years of inactivity, the 87% of the lifetime production will have come before the well went inactive and only 13% after. And so those wells, for the most part, are probably more liability than asset. And I should say that EDF did an analysis last year in the run-up to the passage of SB 1150, the inactive well bill in Texas, which we could talk about.
Please.
We found that if you plugged the 115,000 inactive production wells that the Railroad Commission estimates will cost $15 billion to plug, a large number, we calculated that you would generate around $19 billion in direct, indirect, and induced wages and increase the size of the Texas oil and gas workforce by around 6%. And so, there's arguments for keeping inactive wells available for potential future production, and that's or other purposes, beneficial uses outside of oil and gas production. But for the most part, most of those wells need to be plugged and will benefit everyone when they are, because the property values will go up, you'll get less contamination, you'll be able to use that subsurface for other things.
Now, you just threw out great economics for what it could generate to plug the well, but is that net of the losses of, because there's a lot of families and communities and little stores and machine shops that depend on those marginal wells. So that obviously, if you plug all those wells, now that's Orphan is neutral, but on marginal, that would have, if you are forced into plugging those wells, then you have an offset, don't you?
Well, so the ones I just described are the inactive wells, which are not producing any revenue at all.
And so should not have an economic benefit on the community because they're inactive and nothing's going on.
Right. And so the only potential, one economic benefit is plugging it generates a lot of jobs and activity. If you return it to service and it's producing again, then yeah, sure, that'll produce revenue.
Fair. Good point.
But the vast majority of these wells won't. And so, we need to make decisions about, of these inactive wells, which ones should we keep open in case they're able to be productive in the future, and which ones should be closed. And that is what SB 1150, the inactive well legislation and rulemakings that are happening right now at the Railroad Commission through the end of the year are trying to address. Where it gets really tricky is on this question of marginal wells. So there are 187,000 marginal wells in Texas. 71,000 of them produce less than a barrel of oil equivalent a day. 28,000 are between 1 and 2 BOE a day. Then 19,000 are between 2 and 3 BOE a day. And so it's a very different conversation if you're talking about these sub 1 BOE a day wells versus a 14 or 15 BOE a day wells. Those high producing marginal wells, if you would, are probably economic, and the cost that they're imposing on society is their methane emissions, which you can calculate as social cost of methane. Once it gets down to the very low production, you still have methane emissions, but you also have a fear that well is not producing enough revenue to cover its own closure costs. And those wells will, despite a legal requirement for every operator to plug their inactive wells, which has been on the books for 100 years, a lot of them will get orphaned, and then they'll become a cost to the state to plug. And so, you can't tell people they have to plug their marginal wells. If you're producing, you have a right to produce, and that's that. But what you can do if you want to reduce the emissions from these marginal wells, I want to say it depends. I am a lawyer, but it really does depend on the circumstances. So for some of these wells, it will be economic to do methane mitigation, whether you're replacing pneumatics or doing frequent leak detection and repair or that sort of thing to just get the methane emission percentage down, and then you're all set. But for some of these other wells that are producing very little, and the operator and the community is getting royalty benefits, but the social cost of those wells, the methane that's being emitted and not being accounted for, and decommissioning costs is going to everyone else. And so then you have an economic case as a society to get the well plugged, but the community and the operator and the royalty owner wouldn't want that. And so for those people, you can either subsidize their methane mitigation efforts or subsidize the plugging of the well. one way or the other.
So it does sound like you're suggesting there is a layer of marginal wells that should probably be shut in because they're not economical and are producing more emissions than is justified.
Yes. And, New Mexico is exploring this, and they're doing a rulemaking in New Mexico, which is, where Texas is number one on oil and gas in the country, and is 40% of all production. New Mexico is number two in oil. And they have been working on updating their financial assurance in active well management and well transfer requirements for some time. And one policy that they're likely to adopt is a presumption of no beneficial use for wells that produce less than 90 BOE a year, which is to say a quarter of a BOE a day. And operators will have to show that in order to not get a plugging requirement on those wells, operators will need to show that, in fact, there is an economically viable pathway for these wells to continue operating and meet all their regulatory requirements. So New Mexico may be edging into being the first state to call into question the validity of wells that produce, slightly more than zero.
And so what you've described is that there's kind of two drivers to getting these wells plugged, or looking at the inactive, looking at the marginal. That's a kind of a financial side of helping someone plug them or help mitigate the offset to the communities and what the benefit they get, but also kind of more of the regulatory side, that making more rules, requiring certain things to happen. What's the best way to approach this? It's in a way, I guess it's kind of a combination of the two.
Yeah, well, we have rules on the books where you don't want your well to leak or emit while it's operating, although, we could talk about the EPA methane rule and where that's landing and that sort of thing. And then everyone has rules on the books that you're supposed to plug your well when you're done. And so we want to find the socially optimal way to allow people to produce their minerals and get the oil and gas we need without imposing costs on society for it. And if there are costs that are imposed on society, they get compensated by the people who are earning money from the well. There's lots and lots of policies that can get you there. And, the way that our system works is that you get a law passed in legislature, which is kind of a negotiation between everyone. And then that leads to the regulator doing a rulemaking, which is also a negotiation between everyone. There's all sorts of ways that we can solve these two problems of methane emissions, as well as become increasingly less productive, and then decommissioning costs once they're done. And it's a question of how much of that do you want to do, and who is going to pay?
The common theme out there that I hear is that the stricter the rules are, the more likely you're going to increase the number of orphan wells out there, because people will just give up and walk away, especially because some of these wells are so marginal that they probably don't have the economic capabilities to plug them.
Right. And so then, one thing you could say is, are higher bonding requirements causing wells to become orphaned, or are they revealing wells that were inevitably going to become orphaned because the operator did not save the money in order to plug them? And so, I guess that's kind of a philosophical question.
But a lot of these producers that now have these marginal wells, they bought them as marginal wells, most likely, that when they were big producers, a major might have them, and then the majors kind of push them off to the smaller player who doesn't have that capability and bought it at a low price because it's a low producer.
Right. And so, one can question whether, some of these business models totally work out and people are able to meet their regulatory obligations. And some of them are predicated on not meeting regulatory obligations for whatever reason, including that a feeling that the regulator is not going to crack down on you. And that's a problem. And this has come up now in lawsuits. So there have been several lawsuits against operators for fraudulent transfer. And the case being made is that the transferor knew that the transferee would not be able to meet the obligation to plug the well. and basically just got rid of a liability on the book so that the transferor would no longer be responsible, and it would go on a transferee who is bankruptcy proof, and once they juice the last bit of hydrocarbons out of the well, they'll disappear, and that'll be that. And so there have been lawsuits on those grounds.
Have those come to resolution, or those?
So there's a few, some of them get settled. There was one big one in West Virginia that got settled and created a $70 million plugging fund as a result, which is a small fraction of what's needed to plug the wells involved in that case. But every week, I hear about a new lawsuit going on around abandoned wells, whether it's around transfer or an attorney general suing a company or NGOs suing the regulator for failing to prevent well abandonment and so on and so forth. It's becoming a very litigious space.
So back on the bonding requirements, do you think tougher bonding requirements, will that ultimately protect taxpayers or create more of an issue?
It's potentially a little bit of both. I think that it's important to have bonding requirements in place to de-risk well decommissioning for the public. Ideally, every operator would have had to put up a bond or a sinking fund or something at the beginning of a well's operation. When the well is gushing out, that's the best time to put the cash aside to make sure it can get plugged.
Put it as part of the AFE of the initial drill well.
Right, but we don't have that. So another place to impose additional bonding is during transfer. So Arkansas, for example, in 2018 adopted a rule saying if you transfer a marginal gas well, you have to put up a $35,000 individual well bond on those wells. And what Arkansas found since then was that transfers to micro operators have gone down, bonding amounts have gone up, and well orphaning has gone down. So that's certainly an option. And one of the rules that the Railroad Commission is required to come up with over the next 9 months or so is on the transfer of inactive wells. So that's a possibility there too.
Okay. Well, and those are some great examples of policies that might be able to be applied and have been tested in other states. What are some other ideas as far as what is a fair solution for the community, the operator, the previous owner, the regulators to be able to address this type of issue? And again, it's kind of, I think you highlight the different categories of orphan, inactive, and marginal. So at least solving the well orphaning problem is going to be a combination of financial assurance regulation, so bonds at various points, including on transfer, inactive well management, which is to say limiting how long wells can stay inactive, charging potentially escalating idle well fees to encourage operators to plug their inactive wells, regular integrity testing to make sure the wells aren't leaking and that sort of thing. Well transfer regulations that put more scrutiny on the transferor and the transferee to make sure that the transferee will be able to meet their regulatory obligations. And then for wells that slip through the cracks, it's too late for a policy solution, there's an option of collecting fees from industry to pay for well plugging. So Texas has been doing this, as I said, $20 million a year. It's not enough. Ohio's also been doing $20 million a year. But that 20 million, sorry, Adam, but that 20 million, that's coming from the legislature giving them that money. That's not necessarily coming from fees, is it?
Well, so in Texas, they say that it's coming from severance tax, but it does have to go through the legislature for an appropriation.
So in theory, it's coming from fees from the operator. Okay.
In theory, Colorado, as part of its omnibus rulemaking on this issue in 2022, established a $250 per well per year fee for large operators and a $150 per well per year fee for small operators to create a $10 million annual plugging fund in Colorado. And Colorado believes that $10 million a year plus the federal well plugging money that's coming from the Infrastructure Act is going to be enough for them to deal with their issue. And so basically Colorado's decision was, well, we're going to need to socialize the cost of plugging some of these wells. And so we are going to socialize it to industry rather than to general taxpayers.
And that kind of leads into my last question, talking about on the orphan wells, kind of who should actually pay for that? Is it, and you've addressed this in throughout this conversation, but is it the previous operator, and how do you make that happen, or the taxpayers or the operator? And I'll give you a hint that a lot of those operators won't have the capabilities to do that. So it seems like it heads its way to the taxpayer paying that. Is that how I should look at that?
Ideally, it's the operator who last operated the well. If they can't do it, then every state has its own rules of who is a responsible party. Some states are able to go up the chain of title. Some states go to working interest owners, but the state doesn't want to bankrupt grandma for a well on her property.
Right.
And so if you can't get it from someone who's responsible, then you have to socialize it somehow. And so it can be to taxpayers generally. It can be to the oil and gas industry generally. And then there's also the possibility of carbon credits for plugging some wells that are emissive, but that comes with a huge host of issues, and we would need another hour to talk about that.
In fact, we're going to have a podcast coming up talking about carbon credits, because it is such an important and very complex topic on how to address that. So, so I appreciate you teasing one of my upcoming podcasts, Adam. You're a great guest from that standpoint. So it's well, Adam, we are out of time. This is fascinating, huge issue, huge difference in opinion from industry to environmental advocacies to regulators, and it just somehow we've got to come together and make this be addressed. Otherwise, the problem is only going to get larger and more pronounced in how it affects economies and the environment, it seems. So Adam Peltz with Environmental Defense Fund, really appreciate you being on. Again, if you like Oilfield Strong, if you like hearing the different topics, please follow us. Please share this with other folks that you might know, so we can grow the audience as we continue this conversation. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Adam. Appreciate it.